Adolf Eichmann. A name that would forever be etched into history, not as a warrior on the battlefield, nor as a political leader, but as the man who became the meticulous architect of one of humanity's darkest chapters, the Holocaust. Yet, Eichmann's story did not begin in the grand halls of Nazi power. It began in a modest home in Solingen, Germany, on March 19, 1906. He was the eldest son of a middle-class family. His father was a devout man who worked in business administration, and his mother, a quiet presence in his early years, passed away when Adolf was just a boy. The loss of his mother left a silent scar on his childhood. His father soon remarried, moving the family to Linz, Austria. This city would later prove significant, for it was also the place where a young Adolf Hitler once grew up. As a student, Eichmann was unremarkable. He never excelled academically, often described as distracted and average at best. Friends remembered him as quiet, sometimes awkward, and desperate to belong. He did not stand out as a leader, nor as someone with brilliance. Instead, his life seemed ordinary, perhaps even destined for obscurity. But history has a cruel way of pulling ordinary men into extraordinary evils. By his teenage years, Eichmann had left school without completing his studies. He drifted between jobs, working in sales, as a mechanic, and eventually for an oil company. Those who knew him at the time saw nothing more than an ambitious young man, eager to rise above his modest beginnings. What changed everything was the political storm brewing across Austria and Germany in the 1920s and 30s. The humiliation of World War I, the economic collapse of the Great Depression, and the rise of nationalist ideology created fertile ground for extremism. Eichmann found himself drawn to the growing influence of the Nazi movement. Like many young men of his generation, he was searching for identity, for belonging, for purpose. And the Nazi Party, with its rigid order and dangerous promises, gave him exactly that. In April 1932, Eichmann joined the Austrian branch of the Nazi Party and quickly aligned himself with the SS, the elite paramilitary organization under Heinrich Himmler. For the first time in his life, Eichmann was no longer ordinary. He wore the black uniform of the SS, and in doing so, he stepped into a world where loyalty, bureaucracy, and ideology would transform him into something far darker than anyone could have imagined. This was the beginning of his ascent. Eichmann did not rise to power through charisma or sheer force of will. Instead, he became indispensable for a different reason: his chilling efficiency. He was not a man of grand speeches, nor a fiery ideologue. Instead, he was a bureaucrat, a man who excelled at paperwork, organization, and logistics. In the Nazi regime, where mass murder was not only planned but required vast systems of transport, records, and coordination, Eichmann found his purpose. By the late 1930s, he was already being noticed within the SS for his knowledge of Jewish affairs and his ability to get things done. He had found his niche, and tragically, it was in the machinery of genocide. But how did this ordinary man become one of the key figures behind the Holocaust? How did someone with no remarkable talent for leadership or ideology end up orchestrating the deportation of millions of men, women, and children to their deaths? To understand Eichmann, one must strip away the mask he carefully wore. Beneath the uniform, beneath the cold bureaucratic facade, lay a man who was neither a monster in appearance nor a genius in mind. He was disturbingly human, an average man who allowed obedience and ambition to drown out morality. And it is here that the story of Adolf Eichmann truly begins, not just as a Nazi officer, but as the embodiment of a terrifying truth, that sometimes, the greatest evils are carried out not by fanatics or madmen, but by ordinary men who simply follow orders. By the early 1930s, Adolf Eichmann had traded the life of a wandering salesman for the crisp black uniform of the SS. To the outside world, it may have looked like he finally found a place where he belonged. The Nazi Party, under Adolf Hitler, was no longer a fringe movement, it was a rising force, capturing the hearts and minds of a wounded nation. But Eichmann was no ideologue at the start. He was not drawn by fiery speeches or radical visions of conquest. What pulled him deeper into the Nazi machinery was something far more practical: opportunity. Within the SS, he discovered a system that rewarded obedience, precision, and loyalty. It was a world built not only on ideology, but on bureaucracy, where meticulous record-keeping, efficient planning, and ruthless organization were valued as much as courage on the battlefield. And Eichmann, with his ability to work tirelessly behind a desk, found himself uniquely suited to this hidden war of paper, files, and orders. By 1934, Eichmann had been transferred to the Security Service, SD, the intelligence arm of the SS. It was here that he was assigned to a department dealing with the so-called Jewish question. At first, the work was simple: gathering information, studying Jewish organizations, compiling reports. To Eichmann, it was paperwork, neutral, detached, almost academic. But in reality, these files and reports were the foundation of something far more sinister. He quickly developed a reputation as an expert on Jewish affairs. This was not because of deep ideological passion, but because of his ability to absorb information and organize it systematically. He traveled across Europe, studying Jewish communities, and even visited Palestine in 1937 under the pretense of exploring possible resettlement plans. At the time, the Nazis were still experimenting with different ways to drive Jews out of Europe: forced emigration, exile, and intimidation. Eichmann's role was growing, and with it, his importance within the SS hierarchy. He learned to speak the language of power, using bureaucratic words to mask brutality. To him, deportation became resettlement. Exile became solution. Death became evacuation. It was in this cold, administrative language that Eichmann began to shape the machinery of destruction. By 1939, as war consumed Europe, the Nazis abandoned the idea of Jewish emigration. Instead, the ghettos of Poland were established, cramming entire communities into overcrowded, starving districts. Eichmann was placed at the heart of this operation. His office in Berlin became the nerve center for coordinating transport, overseeing the trains that would soon carry millions to their deaths. Eichmann thrived in this environment. He was not a man to shout orders on the battlefield; instead, he excelled in the quiet cruelty of logistics. He mastered the schedules of trains, the quotas of deportations, the flow of human lives reduced to numbers on a page. And yet, when asked later in life, Eichmann would often insist, "I was only following orders." He portrayed himself as a cog in the machine, a faceless clerk doing his duty. But history reveals a different truth. Eichmann was not just a passive bureaucrat, he was an active architect. He found pride in the efficiency of his work. He innovated ways to make the deportations faster, more organized, more complete. In 1941, the Nazi regime took its most horrifying step. At the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, top Nazi officials gathered to formalize what they called the final solution to the Jewish question. It was a plan for systematic extermination. Eichmann was there, not as a bystander, but as the man responsible for translating policy into action. He listened, he took notes, and then he did what he did best: he organized. From that moment forward, Eichmann's office became the command center for genocide. He arranged the trains to Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor. He coordinated with local officials, ensured quotas were met, and tracked every deportation with ruthless efficiency. For the victims, it was chaos, terror, and despair. But for Eichmann, it was order on a spreadsheet, timetables on a wall. Millions of lives reduced to lines of ink. And this was the true horror of Eichmann, not that he killed with his own hands, but that he made mass murder function like clockwork. He turned genocide into administration. He proved that evil could be carried out not only by monsters with guns, but by clerks with pens. By the height of World War II, Adolf Eichmann was no longer just an SS officer. He was the man who ensured the trains ran on time, not for passengers, but for victims destined for death camps. The world would later remember him as the architect of the Holocaust. January 20, 1942. A quiet villa in the suburbs of Berlin. Snow covered the gardens, the lake was frozen, and inside, around a polished wooden table, 15 men gathered. They drank fine wine, smoked cigars, and spoke calmly about the fate of millions of human beings. This meeting would become infamous in history as the Wannsee Conference. At its head sat Reinhard Heydrich, one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany, second only to Himmler in the SS. Around him were senior officials from the ministries of the Reich, lawyers, bureaucrats, officers. And there, taking notes with almost clinical precision, sat Adolf Eichmann. The purpose of this gathering was not to debate whether the Jews of Europe should be exterminated. By then, mass shootings were already happening in the East, carried out by Einsatzgruppen. Ghettos were already choking with hunger and disease. The question was no longer if, but how. How to make genocide efficient. How to make the machinery of death run smoothly across an entire continent. Eichmann's role at Wannsee was not that of a decision-maker. He was not the one giving orders. Instead, he was the man who ensured those orders would become reality. He carefully recorded every word, then translated policy into logistics, timetables, and instructions. When Heydrich announced that 11 million Jews across Europe, from France to Greece, from Poland to Norway, would fall under the final solution, it was Eichmann who quietly calculated how the trains would run, how the deportations would flow, how the system would never stop until the numbers were met. For him, it was not ideology. It was efficiency. For the victims, it was death. In the months and years that followed, Eichmann became the central figure in coordinating deportations. His office in Berlin was small, staffed by a handful of men, yet its reach extended across the continent. From his desk, Eichmann ordered trains that snaked out from every corner of Europe, Prague, Paris, Vienna, Budapest, each filled with human cargo bound for camps like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor. Survivors who later testified remembered the precision of those transports. Trains would arrive at dawn, one after another, each carrying hundreds, sometimes thousands. Eichmann ensured the schedules did not falter. He pressured local officials to meet quotas. He demanded obedience from railway companies, police forces, and administrators. And always, he framed his work in cold, bureaucratic terms. Deportations were resettlements. Death camps were labor camps. He never visited the gas chambers while they were operating. He never pulled a trigger. Instead, he sat in Berlin and made sure the wheels kept turning, the trains kept rolling, the killing never paused. It is this distance that makes Eichmann so chilling. He was not the monster who raged on the front lines, nor the fanatic screaming propaganda. He was worse, the man who proved that genocide could be carried out by ordinary officials sitting in comfortable offices. And yet, Eichmann was not just a cog, as he later tried to claim. He took pride in his efficiency. He boasted about how many trains he could organize in a single week. Witnesses remembered him as tireless, precise, and even enthusiastic about his work. In 1944, when Hungary fell under German occupation, Eichmann personally went to Budapest. There, he oversaw the deportation of more than 400,000 Hungarian Jews in just a few months, a staggering act of logistical horror. Entire communities were wiped out with ruthless speed, and Eichmann himself was present to make sure everything ran smoothly. By then, the Holocaust was in full motion. Millions had already perished. And through it all, Eichmann remained in the shadows, calm, efficient, invisible. For the victims, his name was rarely known. For the Nazis, he was invaluable. And for history, he became the symbol of a terrifying truth, that genocide does not require madness or rage. It can be executed by quiet men in suits, by clerks with pens, by bureaucrats who measure lives in numbers and see murder as paperwork. This was Adolf Eichmann at the height of his power, the architect, the coordinator, the man who ensured that the final solution was not just an idea, but a reality. But as the war began to turn against Nazi Germany, the empire of death he had built started to collapse. And with it, Eichmann's carefully constructed world would begin to crumble. By 1944, Nazi Germany was crumbling. The Red Army pushed from the east, the Allies advanced from the west, and the empire Hitler once dreamed of began to collapse under its own brutality. But even in these desperate days, Adolf Eichmann did not slow his work. In Hungary, as bombs fell and armies approached, Eichmann orchestrated one of the most rapid and devastating deportations of the entire Holocaust. Over 400,000 Hungarian Jews were sent to Auschwitz in a matter of weeks. For Eichmann, this was not just duty, it was proof of his efficiency, even as the Reich was collapsing around him. Yet, by 1945, the war was lost. The concentration camps were liberated, the gas chambers exposed, and the world began to learn the scale of Nazi crimes. Millions had perished, and Eichmann's fingerprints were everywhere, on the train schedules, the quotas, the deportation orders. But when Berlin fell and Hitler's empire was reduced to ruins, Eichmann vanished. At first, he was captured by the Americans. Like many SS officers, he attempted to hide his identity, using false papers and claiming to be a low-ranking soldier. For a time, it worked. The Americans, overwhelmed with prisoners, failed to recognize him. Eichmann slipped through their grasp and disappeared into the chaos of post-war Europe. He adopted new names, moved between safe houses, and relied on a network of former Nazis who were determined to protect their own. But Eichmann knew he could not stay in Europe forever. The Allies were hunting war criminals, and the Nuremberg trials had already condemned many of his former colleagues. Justice was coming, and he needed a way out. In 1950, aided by a network known as the Ratlins, escape routes organized by sympathizers, sometimes even with the quiet assistance of officials within the Catholic Church, Eichmann made his way to Genoa, Italy. There, under the name Riccardo Clement, he obtained false papers and boarded a ship bound for South America. His destination, Argentina. At that time, Argentina under President Juan Perón was a safe haven for many former Nazis. The government welcomed skilled Europeans, and in the shadows, it turned a blind eye to men fleeing war crimes. Eichmann blended into this environment with ease. In Buenos Aires, he lived a quiet life. He worked at a Mercedes-Benz factory, lived in modest houses, and raised his family. His children attended local schools, his neighbors saw him as an ordinary man, and for a decade, he almost disappeared from history. But the ghosts of the Holocaust could not be buried so easily. Survivors carried memories, names, and stories. For the Jewish people, justice was unfinished as long as Adolf Eichmann walked free. By the mid-1950s, whispers began to surface. A Jewish refugee in Argentina thought he recognized Eichmann. Later, Eichmann's own son bragged to his girlfriend about his father's true identity. Word spread quietly, until it reached the ears of the Israeli intelligence service, Mossad. For Mossad, Eichmann was not just another fugitive. He was the symbol of the Holocaust's machinery, the man who had coordinated the trains of death. Capturing him would not only bring justice, but also send a message to the world: the murderers of millions would never escape accountability. In 1960, Mossad agents launched one of the most daring covert operations in modern history. They traveled to Buenos Aires in secrecy, tracked Eichmann's movements, and confirmed his identity. He was still using the name Riccardo Clement, living in a modest home on Garibaldi Street. For days, they watched him, studying his habits, waiting for the right moment. Finally, on May 11, 1960, Eichmann stepped off a bus after work and began walking home. The agents struck. They overpowered him, shoved him into a car, and drove into the night. Eichmann, the man who had once sent millions to their deaths with the stroke of a pen, now sat in silence, a prisoner himself. He carried no weapon, put up little resistance, and seemed almost stunned that his past had finally caught up with him. But the operation was not over. Argentina was hostile to such extrajudicial captures. Mossad needed to smuggle Eichmann out of the country without detection. They held him in a safe house for days, disguising him, preparing false papers. Finally, under the cover of an El Al flight, they spirited him away to Israel. When the world learned of Eichmann's capture, shockwaves rippled across nations. For the first time, one of the chief architects of the Holocaust would stand trial, not in secret, not in a military court, but in the open, before cameras, journalists, and survivors. Adolf Eichmann, the faceless bureaucrat of death, would finally be forced to confront the world. But the trial would reveal something even more terrifying than his crimes. It would show how ordinary he truly was, and how dangerous that ordinariness could be. May 1960. When news broke that Adolf Eichmann had been captured and brought to Israel, the world was stunned. For the first time, one of the highest-ranking Nazi officials directly responsible for the Holocaust was not only alive, but about to face justice in a public courtroom. In Jerusalem, a specially designed glass booth was built for the defendant. Bulletproof, soundproof, it would hold the man who had once orchestrated death on a scale the world had never seen. When Eichmann was led inside, dressed in a plain suit, thin-framed glasses perched on his nose, many in the audience were shocked. He did not look like a monster. He looked like an ordinary man. But perhaps that was the most terrifying thing of all. The trial opened on April 11, 1961. The charges against Eichmann were overwhelming: crimes against humanity, war crimes, crimes against the Jewish people. He was accused of playing a central role in the deportation and murder of millions. For the first time, Holocaust survivors stood before the world to give testimony. Men and women who had been crammed into ghettos, who had survived Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor, now told their stories in haunting detail. The courtroom was silent as they described the trains, the starvation, the gas chambers. And over it all, Eichmann sat, expressionless, listening through headphones to the translation. His defense was as chilling as it was predictable. "I was only following orders." Eichmann portrayed himself as a mere functionary, a low-level bureaucrat who had no choice but to obey the commands of his superiors. He insisted he was not motivated by hatred, not personally responsible for killing anyone. He claimed he was a cog in a vast machine. But the evidence told a different story. Documents bore his signature. Witnesses recalled his direct involvement. Records showed his personal oversight of deportations. He was not just a cog, he was an essential engineer of the machinery of genocide. The trial was broadcast around the world, making history as one of the first televised global events. Millions watched, not only in Israel, but in Europe, America, and beyond. For many, it was the first time they heard survivors describe the horrors of the Holocaust in their own words. The trial became more than a legal proceeding. It became a moment of education, of remembrance, of reckoning. Hannah Arendt, the political philosopher covering the trial, famously described Eichmann as embodying the banality of evil, a man who committed monstrous crimes not out of fanaticism, but out of thoughtless obedience and ambition. The world struggled with this realization. How could someone so ordinary, so bland, so unremarkable, be responsible for such extraordinary evil? After months of testimony, cross-examination, and evidence, the verdict was clear. On December 15, 1961, Adolf Eichmann was found guilty on all major counts. The court declared him a central figure in the Holocaust, responsible for crimes beyond imagination. The sentence: death. Eichmann appealed, but the appeal was rejected. The Israeli Supreme Court upheld the judgment, emphasizing that his role was indispensable to the Nazi system of extermination. On the night of May 31, 1962, Eichmann was led from his cell to the gallows in Ramla prison. He was calm, almost detached, to the very end. His final words were a declaration of loyalty to Germany, not remorse for his victims. Shortly after midnight, Adolf Eichmann was hanged. His body was cremated, and his ashes were scattered in the Mediterranean Sea, beyond Israeli waters, so that no grave could ever become a shrine. The trial of Adolf Eichmann remains one of the most important in modern history. It was not only about one man, but about the machinery of genocide he represented. It revealed to the world how evil can wear the mask of normalcy, how bureaucracy can become a weapon, and how obedience can turn into atrocity. Above all, it gave survivors a voice, ensuring that the crimes committed in silence and shadows would be spoken aloud for generations to hear. Eichmann's death closed one chapter, but the questions raised by his trial remain timeless. How do ordinary men become agents of extraordinary evil? And how can humanity guard itself against the cold efficiency of those who only follow orders? Adolf Eichmann's death did not erase the crimes he had committed, nor did it close the chapter on the Holocaust. Instead, it opened a new chapter, one focused on memory, justice, and the warning signs of human cruelty. His trial became one of the most important moments in modern history. For the first time, the world was forced to listen directly to Holocaust survivors on a global stage. Their voices, filled with pain but also resilience, carried across continents. Millions of people in Europe, America, and beyond watched as the horrors of the Nazi machine were laid bare in chilling detail. Perhaps one of the deepest legacies of the trial was the realization that evil does not always come dressed as a monster. Philosopher Hannah Arendt, who covered the trial, famously described Eichmann as the embodiment of the banality of evil. He was not a fanatic screaming hatred in the streets, but an ordinary bureaucrat who hid behind orders, forms, and logistics. He showed the world that the greatest crimes can be carried out not only by tyrants but also by quiet men who simply refuse to think for themselves. Eichmann's story forced nations to reflect on responsibility. Could soldiers and officers simply claim, "I was just following orders"? His trial made it clear, obedience is no excuse for crimes against humanity. From then on, international law would demand personal accountability, a principle later applied in trials for war crimes in places like Rwanda and the Balkans. For survivors, Eichmann's execution brought a measure of closure, though not peace. Justice had been served, but the scars of loss could never be erased. Yet, his capture and trial stood as a promise to victims everywhere: no matter how long it takes, the world must not forget, and the perpetrators of such crimes cannot escape forever. Today, Eichmann's name remains a symbol and a warning. A symbol of how deeply cruelty can be disguised in routine tasks, and a warning that blind obedience and silence in the face of injustice can lead to humanity's darkest chapters. His story continues to echo across generations, reminding us that remembering is not only about the past, it is also about protecting the future. And so, the story of Adolf Eichmann is not just the story of one man, it is the story of what happens when evil is allowed to grow unchecked. It is a reminder that justice may be delayed, but it must never be denied. If you found this documentary powerful and eye-opening, make sure to subscribe to my channel, Hidden Epoch, for more untold stories of history that shaped our world. Together, let's keep history alive, so that its lessons are never forgotten.